Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us here today. We're going to start off with a quick video about the project, and then we're going to open up with some opening comments from Carol D'Amico and myself. So if we can roll the video to begin.
States need to look at addressing financial aid because we know now more than ever that post-secondary education is critical to success in today's workforce.
We know that 65% of the jobs of the future are going to require post-secondary education. For many of the students who will be participating in post-secondary education, they need some financial support to help that be a possibility for them. And it's an increasingly diverse student group. So finding the right kind of financial aid to facilitate completion for that diverse group of students is very important to us.
There is a lot of urgency. I mean, there are workforce needs that aren't being met, and we're not necessarily helping the diverse array of students that we would hope to in many states.
Well, USA Fund's mission is to connect education and the workforce. We call it completion with a purpose. And we think that states have a lot of authority and responsibility for helping students finish college and get a good career.
Part of what we want to do with this redesign of the state financial aid system is really help to open the door so all Americans have an opportunity for some post-secondary degree or certification. And in the end, it'll help to grow our workforce.
And for the many of you who are on the live webcast that we're excited to have with people from across the country. We're excited today with the Education Commission of the States and with the USA Funds to be releasing our report on redesigning state financial aid, principles to guide in state aid policymaking. As we sit and think about the big issues that are going on in many of our state legislatures, state financial aid and the possibility of looking at it differently is at the heart of many of those discussions. And really that's why we came together to work on this over these last 6 months and in the next 2 years, because this project is really about helping policymakers think through how they can redesign state financial aid policies to really meet the needs of the changing demographic of post-secondary students. We know that effective education policy occurs when state policymakers at every level and in every state learn from each other. At the Education Commission of the States, we work every day to provide policymakers with unbiased information and opportunities for collaboration so they don't have to recreate the wheel. And I think this project that we're working on with USA Funds is exemplary of that. We actually worked about 3 months ago to put together a team of national experts on financial aid, a team that met for a couple of days to talk about what are the trends and what are the opportunities that should be considered as we look at policy opportunities and the principles policymakers need to be considering. We're excited that not only was their thinking encompassed in this report, but that the work that they did helped to bring forth the 4 principles that we're going to highlight here today. Our panelists, who will be on the meeting in about 10 minutes, are actually ones who were involved in our National Thinkers meeting. And they were very instrumental in the 4 principles that we're highlighting, which include: 1, financial aid policies need to be student-centered. In today's economy, when you look at who the post-secondary students are, we have over 28% of our college students who are parents. 1 in 3 post-secondary students actually are over the age of 25. These changes are important for policymakers to be looking at to meet the needs of those students and to have student-centered financial aid programs. One state example of this is actually California, which we highlight in the report. And California has some changes that they put in place in 2014 with legislation that actually is an example of how to reduce application burden for students and also streamline administration for the state. The second principle that we highlight in this report is that financial aid programs should be goal-driven and data-informed. When you look at today's demographic of college students, 40% of our students are part-time. We also have a reality that 25% of our students are taking online courses in some environment. These are changes that need to be considered so that we can look at what are the goals and where is the data to help us look at what is the best educational pathway for the state financial aid to be focused on. An example of this from a state perspective is Minnesota's 2013 policy that has them exploring the data that they have to look for what are the best educational pathways that they can help to align for their students to have success. The third principle that the report outlines is that financial aid programs must be timely and must be flexible. Only 19% of college students today will achieve their bachelor's degree in 4 years. Over a third of our post-secondary students will transfer to at least a second institution during their educational journey. When we look at the most effective ways financial aid can help, we need to remember that financial aid needs to be there to help students gain access to an educational opportunity or to finally complete that journey. And in many cases, some of the state financial aid programs are limited based on academic calendars or based on timetables that may not apply to today's world. A state example of this that we highlight is really Oklahoma. And Oklahoma has their Higher Learning Access Act, which provides a lot of interesting incentives for their students, but most notably, it actually moves forward some of the financial aid opportunities so that even as early as a junior year of high school, students could find out what their financial aid opportunities are to relieve some of that affordability burden and allow the student to truly focus on what they need to do to be college ready when they make the transition to post-secondary. And the fourth principle that we have in the report is that financial aid programs need to be broadly inclusive of all students' educational pathways and the varying ways students are experiencing education today. When we look across America, 22% of our adults have some college credit, but no degree or certification. Delivery modes of education in this country are changing, with more students engaged in competency-based education programs or modular courses that are delivered on a compressed timeline that do not necessarily track with traditional academic calendars. And then there's also the new versions of online courses. And it's imperative that we figure out how student financial aid can be tracked with some of this. One of the states that we highlight in the report is really Illinois. Illinois has the Monetary Assistance Program that is unique because it is primed for a student's pace of a program completion while including accountability for that progress. At the Education Commission of the States, we work with states so that they can learn from each other about important policies that can make a difference in their outcomes. Many times when we work with states, the first thing they highlight is that their state and their issues are unique. And they are, but there's a way for states to be able to learn from other states and the policies that are in place in other states. And that's what we strive to do each day at the Education Commission of the States. In almost every case, at least one state has already tried a solution at the problem that the state may have. And it's important that we're able to encompass what those successes are, and just as important, possibly what those failures were, so that the states can learn what they can and can't do to reach the outcomes that they desire. In the end, the goal for the Education Commission of the States in a report like this we're releasing today, and in every report, is to exist to ensure that states do not have to recreate the policy wheel. It's truly an honor here today to also be joined with USA Funds. USA Funds is with us and has partnered with us on our National Thinkers meeting that we had in December, on the release of this report, and on technical assistance that we're going to be providing to states throughout the next 2 years. I'm glad to have Carol D'Amico here with me, who is the Vice President of National Engagement and Philanthropy for USA Funds, and has truly committed her career to student achievement and outcomes in many ways. She will talk about completion with a purpose that is part of the goal that USA Funds has, but also be able to talk a little bit about this project and how we've partnered moving forward. So it's an honor for me to introduce Carol to talk about where USA Funds is focused.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning to everybody here in person and joining us across the country. Thank you so much for coming to talk about and listen about this important issue of state financial aid support to our students. USA Funds, for those of you who don't know us, we're headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we are a not-profit organization that's been around since 1960. We actually predated the Federal Higher Education Act, and were formed by a group of business leaders who were very visionary and thought that students, particularly low-income students who were able to go to college, needed financial assistance to do that. So this is an area that is deeply rooted in our organization, and we today are focused on what we call completion with a purpose, and that the biggest challenge that we have in this country is getting more of our students to complete post-secondary education and launch a fulfilling career. The shorthand that we use for that at USA Funds is we like to think of ourselves as impacting what we call the 40-50 50 problem. The 40% of students who start college and never finish. But more important, as important, is the 50% of students who actually do finish and find themselves unemployed, underemployed, or wish they could change their major area of study if they had to do it all over again. We are particularly concerned about 3 population areas, and that's why I'm so excited about this study, because I think that many of our state financial aid programs were designed for a different student population in a very different era, as Jeremy talked about. And our areas of focus are those 36 million adults who have some college but never finished to a credential. The young adults who are disengaged from school, disengaged from their families, the 6 million young adults who need to be focused on not only finishing their high school, but thinking about what the next step is in their lives so that they could launch a successful career for themselves and their families. And the at-risk youth that we still have in high school who are at risk of not even completing high school. So our state financial aid programs, many of them in our states, were formed for the 18 to 24-year-old who went right from high school seamlessly into college, lived on campus. Many of them, not all of them, and that's what the study's future work is going to do, is to highlight those states that are addressing this new era of higher education, not only the changing demographics, but the changing delivery of higher education as well, where students move around from college to college. They move from online education to a physical campus. They stop out and restart. So the era of when many of these programs were formed is very different. Many of us here in Washington, I know, are focused on federal policy and how that affects our students, and that is entirely appropriate, of course, but $11 billion in this country is spent on state financial aid, controlled by governors and state policymakers. And even by Washington standards, I think $11 billion still qualifies for a lot of money. And many governors are starting to realize that maybe there's a way to target these resources to serve this changing demographic and to actually help align education and the economy. And we could not have a better partner than the Education Commission of the states to launch this discussion, representing all sorts of policymakers in a nonpartisan way, constructive way of finding the best ideas and showcasing those and helping states that really want to rethink how they spend their resources for this completion with a purpose. Today is the beginning of the discussion. We look forward over the next couple of years to learn some of these best practices, to share these best practices. And who knows, we may even learn a little something that could help inform the federal policy as well along the way. So thank you to Jeremy and to his team, to our team that's here today, that I hope you'll meet. And we look forward to working with all of you here and joining us via the web over the next couple of years on what we think is a very important topic. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. It's now my honor to transition to the National Expert Panel discussion. And I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Brian Sponsler, who is our director at the Education Commission of the States of our Post-Secondary and Workforce Institute. Brian has worked very closely with a lot of the states and a lot of the national experts on putting this paper together, and has worked dramatically with Sarah Pingle, who is in the room in the back, who is actually the main author of the report. And so we're excited to have Brian help lead a discussion with 4 of our national experts on what are some of the trends in the report and what are some of the policy issues that we need to be considering as we look for change. So we're excited to have Brian and the panelists join us up here on stage right after a short video, which should play right now.
While policy environments are unique state to state, all state leaders are facing a similar challenge of finding more effective methods for providing financial support to students seeking post-secondary education. 4 interrelated principles can assist policy leaders to be intentional about leading a redesign of state financial aid that results in greater access and success for today's college students.
Over a third of our college students are age 25 or older. And it really requires us as policymakers to think a little bit differently about what the typical or traditional college student is. I mean, we need to make sure that we're meeting those students' needs, both from an academic perspective, but a financial aid perspective.
Many states focus their state financial aid on helping students enter college. Today, we need to look at state financial aid to make sure that we help students not only enter college, but to complete college.
State financial aid policies need to be driven by state goals, goals that are clear, transparent, and informed and evaluated by data.
When we look at the data and it shows that 4 out of 10 college students are actually part-time, it really changes the need for flexibility for those students, because this is not a full-time student that is looking at a 4-year degree, yet we want to help them to achieve the post-secondary certification or degree to be a part of our workforce.
And at one point, we sort of had this sort of monolithic thought of what financial aid and college access was. It was the student that graduated from high school on their way for a traditional 4-year degree. Now we need to meet students where they are. Sometimes those will be our older students coming back after a career. Sometimes it'll be from very diverse backgrounds. But really, we need to make it as accessible as possible and still as accountable.
Great. And if I could have our panelists join us, please, while we transition here, that would be great. Good morning. Good morning. There we go. Okay. I should just point out quickly as we're getting settled here, there are those 2 videos as well as some other clips and comments from other experts who participated in the National Thinkers meeting are available online at the statefinancialaid.org website. You can access all the materials we're going to talk about today through that website, as well as some future opportunities for engagement. Let me just start by saying thank you to everybody who's joined us online and here this morning for what we think is a really important conversation about what states can do to be more intentional about designing aid programs to help today's college students. I think Carol and Jeremy's comments both solidify for us why this is an important activity and conversation for both USA Funds and Education Commission of the states to engage in. I want to talk a little bit about the motivations behind this project and what our hopes are for where the work goes from here. Today's just the beginning of a conversation, and I want to make a few of those remarks, and then we'll jump in to the panelist here. The 4 principles that you just saw outlined in the video and that are certainly captured in more detail in the report, those of student-centered, goal-driven, and data-informed, timely and flexible, and broadly inclusive. These are principles that we believe can serve to guide state-level policymakers as they think about redesigning state financial aid programs to respond to the changes that we talked a little bit about in the video and that those of us in the room that work in this issue space know are facing higher education. Changes in our student demographics, certainly about who's trying to go back to college or who's engaging college for the first time. Variability in their enrollment patterns and the delivery models through which they're experiencing higher education and workforce training. Changes in the demands that we are asking for outcomes from our higher education systems, whether that's from parents or families or workforce or civic leaders. And certainly changes in perceptions by families and individuals that are driving behaviors about when they choose to attend college, how they choose to pay for it, and what the responsibilities are and expectations of state support in those areas. We know that state funding plays a huge role in both access and can play a critical role in student success in post-secondary education. And so we think it's natural that in this time of change and continued variability and fluidity in higher ed that we'd revisit these questions now about state aid. With the support of USA Funds, Education Commission of the States began this project late in 2014 and really got officially started with a kickoff National Thinkers meeting held the first week of December in Las Vegas in 2014. And I'd just like to recognize a couple of the individuals that are in the room, Scott Jenkins among others, who contributed to this report. Kevin James is in the back, and thank you so much for your effort and support of these projects. We did not start a conversation about state financial aid redesign at this meeting, and we're certainly not going to offer a pathway to its completion today. But we are hoping to do a couple of things, because we know that states are going to continue to tinker and reform and make wholesale changes to imagining their state financial aid programs. And they're going to do this driven by unique fiscal conditions in their jurisdiction. They're going to do this in response to workforce demands that are requiring different outcomes. And certainly this financial aid redesign conversation is part of our larger discussion about higher education finance and affordability broadly. But what we hope to do today is add some clarity around 4 key principles that we think are relevant benchmarks for these conversations about state aid. In the report and the discussion today, you'll notice that we are intentionally not prescriptive about what bucket of policies we think states should enact to in fact reform their financial aid. And this was by design. We think that rather than telling states what to do, that what we should do is provide benchmarks for their consideration, state technical assistance as a next step in this project, and play a supportive role in helping states figure out what unique policy responses they need for the needs of their communities. We know that consideration of these ideas and principles does not equate to the change we need to see in redesigning state financial aid. But certainly I know that all of us who've been engaged in this work have a core belief that if we can help states learn from each other and frame these conversations in intentional and productive ways, if we can examine questions about how to be student-centered and proactive in the aid policies we have, if we can be driven by goals that are easily understood and provide clarity for the outcomes we're seeking from our aid programs, if we can provide aid to students at a time and in a way that makes a difference to their enrollment decisions and the likelihood of persistence at key points in time, and if we can be broadly inclusive and supportive of new delivery methods of post-secondary education and the different patterns that students are experiencing in higher ed, we'll have moved ourselves closer to the outcomes I think we all want to see. The face of higher education has certainly continued to change, and it will continue to do so. What we hope to do through this project is help our policymakers think about aid programs to support the students of today and tomorrow to move us forward. So that's why we've undertaken this project, and a little bit about what we hope to do, starting with today's panel discussion. What I'd like to do is jump in, but let me offer a couple of notes just on process. We're going to spend about the next 25 to 30 minutes having a facilitated conversation among the panel and myself. The panelist bios were included in the materials that those of you that are participating online should have received an email this morning, and hopefully folks here had a chance to pick up, so we can sort of dispense with the formal laundry list of introductions, other than for me to just say thank you to all 4 of you for being here today. I know everyone's busy, and we really appreciate your support of this project. And I think that those of you that have a chance to review the bios are going to find the array of professional experiences that these folks have had, both in their current roles and in previous experiences, to provide us with a lot of depth and breadth to have this conversation. We'll have an opportunity for questions for those of you that are here and also online, so please do submit those questions through the webcast feature, and Sarah will make sure that we get those asked at the end. We are going to do questions toward the end of our time together, so if you need to make a note to jog our collective memory to go back to something that comes up early in the discussion, please do that. So, Ben, I think I'm going to start with you. Let's just jump right in here. You have worn many different policy hats in your professional career as a legislator. You've worked in the governor's office, now certainly as an executive of a state higher education agency. How have you seen these discussions of financial aid and its role in supporting state education and workforce goals kind of change differently in each of those areas? And maybe you could share a little bit about where the state of Oregon currently is.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Well, I think I'd say at the first, sort of at the outset, that there's probably insufficient attention to the impact that state financial aid has on students, on higher education, from legislators, from governors, from the public. We in Oregon have a grant program that awards about $2,000 per qualifying student towards their cost of higher education. That's a pretty significant state program. It doesn't come close to meeting the need, but given the fact of that, it is perhaps surprising that there isn't more attention at many of those levels of state government to ways in which financial aid can and should be designed in order to maximize the impact. That said, there is certainly a discussion underway. The agency that I lead, the organization that I lead, is a part of that, attempting to understand how we can reshape our state financial aid program in order to have a greater impact on student success and access. I think there are policymakers increasingly coming at this from the completion agenda sort of point of view, concerned not only with access but with student success. Legislators, seemingly every session, have proposals for targeting these dollars towards certain fields, for example, STEM fields, right? We've had that legislative proposal each of the last several sessions. Our commission has brought forward a proposal to focus the dollars on the very highest need students, understanding that we can't serve everyone who the program is designed to serve. I think what our state financial aid model has done to the conversation in Oregon at all levels is create a mechanism, a framework for understanding affordability in a somewhat more sophisticated or nuanced way than policymakers and the public tend to look at it. You know, you ask the public, what is college affordable or not, and they look at tuition and they say, well, it's going up, it's high, and so college is unaffordable. Our approach to state financial aid, which takes not just tuition, but the full cost of attendance, and then sort of subtracts the expected family contribution, a Pell Grant if a student's eligible, assumes that the student works part-time and puts dollars in that way, borrows a little if they're attending a public university, and then defines the gap between those sources of support and the total cost of attendance and says, that's the need, and we're going to try to fill that. That has certainly helped to, I think, improve the conversation, give us a kind of absolute measure of affordability that policymakers in our state, at least, are increasingly focused on as they attempt to address this really urgent public need around affordability.
Yeah. That's great. Sandy, do you want to maybe follow in? I know we've talked a little bit, and you've mentioned before sort of the notion of these conversations about access and then these conversations about completion, and whether in fact these should be two sort of separate approaches to aid policy, or we could fold those notions together, as Ben's suggesting is happening in Oregon.
Sure. I mean, I think that state financial aid programs were designed when we were thinking about access as the problem, and if we could just give money to the students who needed it, then we would solve the problem. I think we've discovered that just giving money to these students is not enough, although maybe if we gave them more money, we can make more progress. I'm not sure whether this is true, but I think it's entirely possible that the movement in the early 1990s towards some states going to their merit aid programs, where they started directing their subsidies towards students who didn't actually need the money, while I don't think that was constructive in terms of policy, may have been constructive in terms of getting people to stop and think about state grant programs and what they could accomplish. And I think, though, that part of the reaction has been anything that has anything to do with academic success seems counterproductive, because there's considerable evidence that it's the students with lower incomes and with more financial need whose behavior will be affected by student aid. So that has made people very much afraid of thinking about academic success as part of a need-based aid program. And I think one of the good things that we're talking about now and realizing is that that doesn't have to be the case. It's one thing to say, you didn't do well in high school, so forget it, we're not going to help you with financial aid. It's another thing to say, we want everybody to try this, and we want to create structures that will support their success. And it's more really about providing incentive and support than it is about just rewarding people. So I think that, for example, if you look in simple terms at the efforts in many states now to get people to take 15 credits, sort of the 15 to finish movement. I mean, it's pretty clear that if you want to get a bachelor's degree in 4 years or an associate degree in 2 years, you're going to have to take at least an average of 15 credit hours per term. There's been a lot of resistance to that because, of course, there are many students, as we've already discussed, who are enrolled part-time and who have no choice other than to enroll part-time. So I think we have to think carefully about, look, I mean, if you say you can't get financial aid if you're part-time, then you are eliminating all kinds of students who really need help. But if you say, we will give you more support as you enroll more intensely because we know that that will increase your probability of success, then you are providing an incentive and the support for students to do as much as they can. And when we tell them that we won't give them more money if they enroll really full-time than if they take 12 credit hours, we're saying we're not going to help you do that. So it's part of it is semantics. I think the way we articulate this makes a lot of difference, but I think we have to really think about how we can support students to study in ways and pursue education in ways that increase their probabilities of success without excluding the students who face all kinds of barriers and are not able to follow the paths that we might think would be the best for getting them as quickly as possible to their goals.
That's great. Monica, I want to ask you to jump in here. I know, and maybe just a general response to either of our prior discussions, comments, but I also know that NEBI's been engaged in some of this work with your member states, both collectively and individually. And I'm wondering if you could share some lessons that you've sort of drawn out from some of that work, or at least some of the issues that are happening in the Northeast region around this redesign conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brian. Well, so hi everyone. So at NEBI, we've been lucky enough to be supported by Luna Foundation to work with 3 New England states in evaluating or analyzing or looking a little bit deeper into their state grant aid program, and then thinking about, what are some particular ways that those programs could be improved in the future, either policy-wise or programmatically. And I think, I guess just to respond to Sandy's comment, I think that's a really good point. Communication and to students and making sure that they understand what the goals of a program are or what funds are available is really important. And I would say that's one of the lessons that we've learned is, even if we share student level data and do that sort of analysis, we're not going to get at how did students react to the program or how did they view the program and its ability to support them in their studies. And I think that's sort of a crucial part of when we think about redesigning a policy or a program is, we can all sit here and talk about what those priorities or principles or ideals could be, but ultimately on the ground, I think the way a student interacts with those funds is going to be telling as to whether or not it'll be successful.
Ben, I see you nodding. Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I think that we've tended to think at a policy level about impact in terms of dollars per student, right? And some of what this discussion suggests is that impact likely involves other things too. How is notification provided to the student? So this year, for the first time, our receiving students received emails sort of at the date, and it's an early date, it was February, of award directly to their email account saying, here's your award and here's what you can do with it. It came from our office. I don't know what the impact of that is. We haven't studied it. We haven't talked to the students. We don't know. But that other mechanisms to understand how to maximize impact that aren't necessarily all dollars based. So I just think it's an important conversation and an important feedback loop for us to consider.
Allison, I want to ask you to jump in here a little bit and help us throw another issue on the table, which is really how the discussions that we're having here about what states are doing, how they are impacted or should be impacted by the financial aid redesign conversations that are happening at the federal level that I know you've been involved with previously and certainly still are. Sure. Are these two parallel tracks where we kind of let each system do their own thing, or should we find some areas that we can maybe work together on some of these issues?
Well, I would respond by saying that I think there are opportunities. It's actually a necessity that we work together between state and federal policymakers, but there also are significant responsibilities of each entity, states and the federal government, that are, I guess, are divergent in some sense. So, I get the sense that there is a commitment to a national conversation around the need to address this new traditional student population. But it's a lot slower, I think, for federal policymakers to make changes in federal statute and regulation to address some of the needs that this changing student demographic have. And that's why USA Funds was particularly interested in this project at the state level, with the hopes that we could engage and support work being done at the state level, perhaps to move this conversation along a little bit more quickly. I do think, though, that there is a broad recognition that the student demographic is changing, that there is a need to better align our student financial aid policies with our workforce policies and what's happening in our communities and in our states. And I don't think that that's much different, to be honest, than the conversation that's happening at the federal level.
Yeah. Monica, does that make sense from where you or Ben, where you sit at working more directly with states? It certainly does for us. I think that there's always been these sort of conversations at the state level about whose role and responsibility are these types of things. Is that Ben, how's that playing out for you?
Well, I think
'Cause I know.
at the state level, I at least tend to operate with the assumption that we shouldn't expect anything on the federal side or any change on the federal side. When it comes, if it comes, great, that may be great, but we tend to operate with just almost blinders on around the federal piece because we know what we can control, which is the state piece. There appears to be very little action, and that may change with Higher Ed Act. And but nevertheless, I think our focus remains pretty squarely on the state level, and I think there are a lot of opportunities there to design a more effective state aid program, to invest more in it, to impact a lot of students. I mean, I mentioned the $2,000 per student and how significant it is really when you step back from it. The state is essentially writing checks of $2,000 to tens of thousands of students. We would like and need for that to be much greater in order to meet the gap. But that's a pretty significant level of state investment for any state, and certainly one like Oregon.
Monica, any thoughts about that federal intersection?
I'd say our project has focused a little bit less on that, and I certainly think Ben's comments would probably be the most accurate since he's from a particular state, and I just get to work with 6.
Yeah, well, no, that's great. And one of the things that we're talking about, sort of timing of policy change, but I want to go back to this notion of time that Sandy brought up a little bit about incentives, and Ben has addressed in terms of timing of award letters and those types of things. And certainly, we discuss in greater detail in the report. And that's sort of, how do we take into consideration both timing of award notifications to incentivize and change behaviors? And Sandy, maybe more broadly, you could talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done there in looking at how we can change student behaviors with some of our policy responses. But also how, being tethered to sort of a traditional academic calendar and the aid programs being tethered to those things is somewhat dispersed or somewhat challenging for disbursements. I know, Ben, in Oregon, you guys have tackled this a little bit by trying to move some dates around. But I'd like for all four of you to sort of think a little bit about what do we do with these notions of time, and how do we provide aid to students at a moment and place that it can make the most difference in what they're trying to do educationally. I don't know, either one of you wants to, Sandy.
So, I mean, there are different issues, of course, for traditional age college students and for older students, because one of the approaches that I think people believe has the potential to make a big difference, although I have to say the evidence is not definitive about it, is to let young people know early on about the aid that's available. Because if you grow up thinking that college is unaffordable, out of reach, then you have very little incentive, as we all know, to sort of succeed academically, to graduate from high school, to do well enough to prepare for college. So if we could actually let students know that there is money for them and that they will be leaving that money on the table if they don't go to college, then they may be more likely to prepare. There's a lot of evidence in behavioral economics that people perceive losses differently than they perceive comparable gains. So if they have the money and then they're going to lose it, and I don't mean you put it in their pocket, but you say to them, you're going to get, $5,000 a year for college if you go to college. They know they have that money, and then they're losing the $5,000 a year if they don't go to college. Then that could make a very big difference in their behavior and in their college access and success. Now, that solution, I think, is something really important to work on. I think we have to think really hard about how that can support older students who obviously, to whom this doesn't apply. I mean, you could let them keep that promise for a while, but you're not going to let people keep that promise until they're 40 years old based on their financial circumstances in high school. So we need to think carefully about notification and about helping students to plan earlier on. I think one of the problems that we have with adult student success is that it strikes them and then they do whatever they can do as quickly as possible, and whatever they saw an advertisement for yesterday is where they head. And if we can help them by giving them more guidance and advice in a way that allows them to plan more carefully, that should also be constructive.
So we have state of Oregon has a financial aid program, a single program for adult students as well as traditional college age students. And it's neutral in terms of its treatment of those and whether they're attending community college or a public university or a qualifying private institution. The sort of fundamental policy question for our commission has been how to essentially triage the program given the insufficient dollars to serve all the students who qualify. It's designed to be a lower and middle class sort of entitlement. And we don't have nearly, I think we have probably 20% of the dollars that we would need in order to meet the full gap. The way that we have historically allocated scarce resources has been on the basis of application date. The sooner a student applies via the FAFSA, the more likely they are to receive an award. If they qualify and they submit their FAFSA early in January, they'll get the award. We, as a commission, looked at that and decided, look, there are fairer and more effective and more impactful ways to allocate scarce resources. And so rather than using the deadline as the way to triage, we are proposing and working with the legislature on a proposal that would permit the commission to allocate those dollars to the students with the greatest financial need. That will have the effect of permitting students to apply and receive the award much later in the calendar year. It will likely shift more of the dollars to the older adult student, and probably some shift to community college students as a result. There's clearly no perfect solution here. It's balancing a lot of these levers, and we've played with award size as well. That's the other sort of primary mechanism we've used to sort of triage the award, has been to bring down the caps. We've proposed a supplemental award to encourage retention, persistence. We would give certain students a reward for sort of satisfactory academic progress year over year, trying to really cement their ability to receive that award, or the durability of the award year over year, in order to get to those completion goals.
So if I could just jump in, I mean, Ben, some of the examples you've just given, I think, speak really well to the point that maybe I was trying to make just previously when Brian asked me about the federal and state connection. And thinking about what you just described, you just laid out a lot of different kind of options that you've considered, things that you've attempted, policies that you've considered, and you've done that probably relatively recently in a relatively short amount of time. And you've probably learned a little bit about that. And I guess not my necessarily criticism, but maybe the opportunity I think that USA Fund sees in this work is that states have a little bit more nimble nature to try some new things, attempt to address some of these policy concerns in maybe a little bit more quicker fashion than the federal government, and see what you're learning from that and be able to share that learning and perhaps scale it or replicate it with other states. So.
Yeah, if I could jump in.
Sure.
I think that question on timing and sort of the word triage here is just so apt, because what we've seen, at least we're working with Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maine, and I would say what we've seen is the legislative cycle just doesn't match sort of student decision making. And I think the ECS paper does a really great job in sort of outlining that broadly, and pointing to, I think, some of the holes there in alignment. And I wish that there were a nice solution to that. I realize that, state budgets are always a bit of a bear to wrestle with, and to be able to say, yes, we're going to be able to fund this program. And in New England, what we've seen, at least with one of our states, is they don't notify students until after the state budget is set, because they don't want to pull back funds from students, to your point, Sandy, on telling someone they received funds and then losing it. And I don't know that sort of timing lends itself to having a state financial aid program that's able to really, I guess, support these state goals that I think some programs have sort of espoused to.
Yeah, well, we talked a lot at the national meeting, and certainly through the development of the report, about the three calendars that are in play here. The legislative calendar about how we're going to make some changes to policy that we know need to be made, even if we have agreement on what those changes are to be, which isn't always easy to get. The academic calendar that flows sort of and drives a lot of our conversations about higher ed. And then, as Sandy pointed out, the student calendar about decision making and when they make those decisions to seek additional training to move in it. And when those three don't align, I think we certainly confront some of the problems. These aren't easy solutions to these, but these are the kinds of things that I think we want to highlight and make sure that at least at the front end of the redesign conversations, people are cognizant of. We can mitigate some of the challenges in those calendaring schedules. We probably can't erase them, but I think it's important that we can at least name them. Monica, I want to go back to you for a quick second. You mentioned it just sort of briefly in passing about the data exchange part of the project and sort of the use of state level data to sort of analyze the impacts of some aids and some of the changes. We certainly talk about that in the report. Could you share a little bit about the way states are using, or the states you're working with are using data to inform these redesign conversations?
Sure. Well, I guess it's different depending on the state, and I think most of us know that. I'd say what's been really interesting is, the student level data that we've shared with these states doesn't really lend itself to answering these questions of, did this state financial aid program end up inducing a student to enroll in a public institution, or did it really help them to complete? I think those sorts of questions require many more data elements than we had to share. But I do think that the data that we've shared and those sort of findings have started to build a bridge, I think, across the higher education community within the state. Because I think sharing that information about, what is the student profile of a state grant recipient, or, what's the average award per student, or those sorts of elements that Ben mentioned earlier, I think can really be the beginning of a conversation with higher education institutions and with community-based organizations and college access programs and all of these other initiatives that are happening in a state around, well, how do all of these initiatives and support systems complement each other, and how can then they be, I guess, capitalized upon, and how can we build further collaborations between all of these programs to be able to, I think, support some of the student decision making that Sandy described. So that, fingers crossed, that that's what will happen.
Yeah, that's great. Sandy, any just sort of thoughts about what types of data elements we should hopefully be suggesting states can collect? And I'm sure you've got a laundry list. We just have a couple minutes, so you can keep it to the most important ones. But I think there are these questions about whether the traditional kind of elements that we have and data points that we know about the student experience are in fact the right ones to help inform this conversation.
Well, obviously, this is a problem that would be better solved at the national level than at the state level, because we lose many students because they go to college out of state, because they move out of state after college. So there is a limit to the extent to which states can solve the problem. But we need to, but many states have done a really great job of collecting data. We need to know who the students are, we need to know all the relevant characteristics, and we need to know where they go and what they do and how they end up. I think that there's a real risk of whatever you measure becomes your goal, and we have to be very careful. We will never be able to have data about many of the important aspects of education, right? Education is not just, we're not just trying to give people pieces of paper, and we hope they get good jobs when they have that piece of paper, but we want more for them than that. And we end up, rather than having discussions about what our goals really are and what really is meaningful in students' lives, whatever it is we can measure, that becomes the conversation. So part of it is getting better data, obviously tracking students as they move from one institution to another, learning as much as we can about how they are actually financing college. And I think one thing I think of all the time is that because we have no other method for this, everyone says, well, whatever your expected family contribution is, that's how much you can afford to pay. And nobody really wants to look at that number and what it means. And of course, it's a pretty arbitrary measure of how much students can afford to pay. So we need to look with more depth at the data, but we also have to be very careful and acknowledge that, one, descriptive causation and correlation are not the same thing, and you can't jump to conclusions by just looking at the data. And two, the data are always going to be imperfect, and we have to think, not just measure.
That's great. So that's a powerful reminder and point for all of us. I would just want to kind of throw it open and give anyone a chance to say anything they've been thinking about. I've seen some notes being scribbled. We're kind of coming to the time where we can engage our audience here and also through the webcast. But I didn't want to steal anybody's final thoughts that they might have had about either a particular element or principle talked about in the report or anything that we've heard here. Maybe I can start with Allison just because she's right here on my on my left. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I just made a note as we were talking. There are kind of three words that come to mind for me when we look at these principles, and it's the conversation around fit and helping students identify the right fit for themselves with the institution that they select or the institution to where they're accepted, and finance, of course. Thinking about the financial aid and financing policy that supports their success, but also even their ability to save and prepare for college. And finally, that would be to ensure that they finish and that they complete. So kind of the idea of fit and finance and finish all together, wrapped up into some of the principles that have been laid out in this report. I think it's really critical to think about those elements as we move this conversation forward.
Well, and as a big fan of alliteration, I can appreciate the three F's there. So that's helpful. Ben, any sort of final?
Sure. I just wanted to follow up on the data piece for a minute. We live in a really remarkable time with respect to student data. Our agency maintains that data for financial aid, for enrollment, for completion, for public university and community college students, and we can put all that together. And we've done so, and it appears, and I want to be really careful about how I describe it, it appears to tell some really powerful stories about the impact of financial aid on student completion, and in particular our state financial aid program. And we've controlled for a lot of things, and it appears to show that students who receive the state grant are several, 5% or more likely to complete than similar students who don't. It appears to have a greater effect than the Pell Grant, which is a significantly larger award. It left us scratching our head. I think it gets to Sandy's point about being careful. Correlation is not causation. These students who, and I mentioned our early deadline, the students who receive our state grant are likely students who are more motivated, or could be students who are more motivated. They got their paperwork together early in the calendar year for the upcoming year, and so we're working with all of that. But I do think there's a lot of promise and opportunity in the data to better understand the impacts of these choices.
That's great. Thanks.
So I'm going to actually say something that is a caution about just thinking about the important principles that are articulated, because I think that one of the very important things that this report says is you have to be flexible, you have to be innovative, you have to understand that the nature of how students study and earn credentials is changing over time and doesn't necessarily fit traditional patterns. And we definitely have to support students in new patterns, but we have to be really careful, because it is too easy to just say, oh, there's an innovative thing that looks like it's going to be the solution to all of our problems. Let's throw money at it. Let's make sure students can do this, before we know that either the students or the institutions are going to be accountable. And you could really broaden the scope of your aid programs by giving money to everybody no matter what, and then realize that you've not actually helped those students so much and you've sort of gotten into a mess. So I would say move forward, be flexible, innovate, but do it very carefully and cautiously, and make sure you have good evidence and don't just dig more deep holes for where the money might go.
Excellent. Thank you. Monica, we'll give you the last word.
Thanks. No pressure, right?
That's right. Yeah. Very profound, please.
Well, I do think that cautionary note is so important, and I think that's one of the reasons why this project is so exciting. And thinking about our Redesigning Student Aid in New England project and the amount of energy that it's built around the region and interest in sort of sharing lessons across state lines, I think this ECS project and this principles paper is, what an exciting opportunity it is for us to talk nationally about this issue and to share the lessons learned and to share, I think, some of those cautions and also some of those innovations across state lines. And so it's just so exciting, I think, that the principles have been articulated in one document that's accessible to folks with state-specific examples. And I think it's just really the beginning of a fantastic project. So congratulations to ECS.
Thanks. I did not pay her to say that, I promise. So what we want to do now with some of the time we have remaining is engage those of you here, obviously, that have spent a lot of time in both your personal and professional lives, I think, thinking about these issues, and engage some questions for our panelists. And then certainly those of you that are participating in the webcast online have the opportunity to submit those questions. Amy Skinner, the Director of Communications here at the Education Commission of the States, has a microphone for those of you in the audience. I know this is a small room, and we certainly wouldn't have any challenges in hearing questions, but if you could wait for the mic so that the people who are participating in the webcast can hear the question, we'd appreciate it. So maybe start. Anybody here have anything they want to? Yeah, sure.
First of all, Kevin Kruger, president of NASPA, nice work. So one of the things that came through was this sort of combination of paying attention to access, but also completion. And so let me dig into the part-time issue. That 4 out of 10 students are enrolled part-time, and it seems like whether they're traditional age, or adults, this is sort of the death knell to completion, is being part-time. So it's not just money, obviously, it has to be something else. I'm just interested in thoughts about what else can we do to advance, and what's happening at the state level to advance completion for part-time students so that that money invested pays off in terms of completion. Thanks.
I think, yeah, both Ben and Sandy touched a little bit on these questions about sort of financing plus and one of those other structures. I don't know if either of you want to solve the part-time completion issue.
No, I certainly can't solve it. I am struck, though, and this really doesn't answer your question. If anything, it just sort of complicates it. But I'm struck with there are different types of part-time students, right? So one type of part-time students that we in a lot of states have our sights on is actually the 12-credit student who's full-time as far as our state policy and federal policy is concerned, but is not going to finish in 4 years or 2 years, depending on the degree type. That's one type of part-time student. Then there's the let's say the 6-credit student who's probably could be an adult working full time. You know, it's a night and evening or however student, and it's going to take different sort of approaches to each of these. On the 12-credit, sort of we're starting to think of them really as part-time, even though technically they're full-time under definitions. We're focusing on that, saying how can we nudge them to 15? Can we use the financial aid program and some additional dollars for those students to sort of push them to 15 and keep them at 15 in order to support their ability to finish in 4 years? But I think the question you were asking around the sort of 6-9 credit student, that's another story entirely. I did say our program is equally open to those students. We think that's an important principle to maintain. It's going to take a lot of strategies to improve the completion rates with those.
Yeah, well, Ben, maybe I can ask a follow-up on that. I mean, do you have any, does your organization having conversations with folks at the institution level about what types of strategies and approaches they're taking, or are there some kind of coordinated approach to some of this stuff? How are those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the conversations are very active, and the whole sort of student success agenda that includes increased emphasis on orientation, bridge programs, coaching, mentoring, counseling, wraparound supports, which are equally necessary for your traditional age population and your older population. More accessibility in terms of scheduling, right? So for that part-time population that is going to need courses at different times of the day, on weekends. I mean, we're very much involved in those conversations with institutions. Of course, institutions are where most of that work is taking place. We're attempting to support it through state investments, through focusing funding on student outcomes to create incentives and rewards for institutions to invest in student success. There's no silver bullet, and it's an important problem.
Yeah. Great, sure. And then we'll get Brian in the back.
Excuse me, I'm Frank Ballman with the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs, and I salute the group for focusing on the needs of non-traditional students. Because I think one thing that's disappointing for us was in the RAD white papers, there really was more focus on traditional students. So my question is, there's a lot of talking about performance funding. 30-something states have performance funding, but the thing that stands out to me is the states where the performance funding is directed to the student have had tremendous success. If you saw Indiana gives larger grants to students who take 15 credits rather than 12, and the percentage of students taking 15 credits was up 40 to 60% in most of their state publics. And Texas has an innovative program there as well. So I'm curious what the group thinks about state performance funding, in particular student performance funding.
Anybody want to take that?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. We have a lot more evidence about the effectiveness of grant programs that do things like give more money for 15 credit hours or give bonuses after you complete a certain number of credit hours. That kind of incentive certainly seems to make a difference for students, at least for certain groups of students. The evidence about the institutional performance-based funding is still, we're still not sure. I mean, everybody's going that direction and it's promising, but there are a lot of questions about it. So if we're student-focused, then we need to think, I think as we've been saying, about how to structure these programs so that they will both provide monetary incentives and also provide the framework for students to do this. I mean, you're saying you want to count 12 credit hours as part-time. I mean, why would a student think that was, I mean, we hope that they can multiply, but still, if we tell them they're full-time, of course they think they are. So we need to think about the expectations. And I think this gets to the success question of part-time students. We just need to think harder about what these students need, how these students make decisions. I mean, first of all, they need more money to be able to take more courses because they have to pay for the courses and they may be able to work less. How does this fit with their developmental education? There's obviously a huge overlap between part-time and developmental, and can we structure things so that we facilitate their making progress and think about how they feel about making progress. I mean, there's no getting around. If you go part-time, it's going to take you a long time. I mean, and I think trying to say, well, we know you don't have time, we'll make it quicker for you isn't the solution. It's to get them to have visible progress along the way. Maybe it's to set goals, maybe it's to go for short-term credentials on which they can build. But there are lots of things you can do for students and change behaviors, and that's probably a lot easier than changing institutional behaviors.
And I would say, to build on that, I think you're very similar to sort of state performance-based funding formulas. There's a lot of ways to design those sorts of incentives, and I would say for a state grant program, I think there's more to it than just the amount of money or what the requirements would be. It's is it tied to student support services? Is it tied to other things like in the ASAP program where they get an unlimited Metro card? I mean, that's a really big deal to certain students, I would imagine. I know to me when I was an undergrad in Manhattan, it certainly was. But so I think those are things to think about with these sorts of program designs, is that it's not just necessarily incentive or not, it's what sort of incentive. And Frank, I'm sure you're aware of Massachusetts Completion Incentive Grant Program pilot. So I think that pilot is nearing its completion, and so I would say definitely keep an eye out for that if that's of interest. And just to tag on, if I may, to the sort of part-time question, I really like the distinction that Ben made in terms of different types of part-time students, but I also think there's that question of, well, why are students part-time? And if they're part-time because they need to earn additional funds, is there a way where, there could be a different usage of campus work-study funds, or could a state internship program, a state-funded internship program, help to supplement and answer some of those challenges that those part-time students are facing? And, or maybe it's daycare on campuses. And I think those sorts of questions or answers to those questions may help get at some of those potential solutions.
So I think we have a question, Brian, we'll get to you in a second. I just want to take a question, thanks for your patience, from our online and virtual participants. Sarah.
Yeah, there's been a lot of engagement on the webcast, which is exciting. Many of the questions center around the role of states in supporting low-income students, and if that should be a primary focus of state policymaking or not.
Great, so I know, Ben, you mentioned a little bit about the focus of the Oregon program. I don't know, Allison or Monica or Sandy, anybody want to jump in with another example they know about, and then we can have Ben talk a little bit about why that approach was taken in Oregon. Is that?
Well, I'll say, for another project, I was reading a lot about Tom Mortenson's recent sort of series of releases on the NIPSAS data. That was, I think it was a series between March through May of 2014, for those of you who subscribe to Post-Secondary Opportunity. But I think what was really striking to me is that regardless of how you measure sort of unmet need, the bottom two income quartiles have the biggest burden. And so I think it is really important to make sure that those folks are involved in the conversation, or that are included in these policy conversations. I also think, to Ben's point, about that the program is only funded at 20% of what would be ideal. And for those of you who read Dennis Jones's Change article last summer as well, that's saying if states were to meet all unmet need for students in order to reach these college completion goals, we're talking about like a $1 trillion bill. And I wish that there were an easy answer to how are we going to get there. But I think part of it is going to have to be partnering with institutions and thinking about what are the ways that institutional grant dollars are being used, what are the ways in which we're supporting these students to complete in other areas besides just financial, because it's not enough. We just don't have those funds, I think, to be able to do that.
So that's a really important point, that it's not just about money. I mean, low-income students obviously face many more barriers than other students. It is, when you hear the sort of, well, low-income students get the money and middle-class students are left, high and dry, obviously, I don't think those middle-class students want to trade places with the lower income students. There's rarely anything that makes them leapfrog over them. So I do think that should be their primary focus. That said, we have to understand that middle income families and students are very different from upper income families. There's a huge gap, and looking at what it costs to go to college these days, there are obviously financing problems among middle income students as well, and I don't think that it's right to focus exclusively on low income students without paying attention to that other growing problem.
Great. Brian, do you want to get a chance to get your question in? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Brian Bridges with UNCF. My question is around the intersection or integration or informing of what's going on at the federal level and the roiling debate around how to redesign financial aid. If any states are actually using that to inform their work, particularly some of the recommendations that came out of the RAD white papers, or do states realize that the federal government isn't going to do anything anytime soon, despite all the talk and all the recommendations, and that they need to set the bar for the feds to actually move?
So I sort of answered that earlier in the sense that we have a little bit of a head in the sand approach when it comes to the federal work, because it just our default assumption is that not much will change at the federal level. That may or may not be true. I will say one place that I know we've been very directly engaged has been around the FAFSA, potential FAFSA changes, partly because they so directly impact what our own state-based program. I mean, this is a very tangible effect on our state-based work. If the FAFSA were to significantly change, it would very significantly impact what data we have in order to operate our state need-based aid program. So that's sort of a partial way in which we're connected to and following the federal work.
I mean, I'll just offer my opinion. I do think that it's important to find ways to actually have a stronger conversation between state and federal policymakers on some of these key issues. When we're talking about state financial aid redesign, what parts of the elements of the redesign could be impacted or are impacted by changes in the federal statute? Are there connections? Are there ways that some of this work could be integrated or at least talked about? And I think any opportunity to forge a dialogue or have that conversation is important. I can't pull out specific examples of perhaps where that's happening. But I do think in order to move this conversation forward in a very meaningful way, we have to figure out how to integrate that work.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, I would add and say to those comments, I think Ben's response is one that we hear often from state leaders who say, look, we kind of have our hands full on these issues our own. We're trying to make some adjustments at a quicker pace than we think the feds are going to come. But part of what is important to ECS and I think USA funds as well about this work, is part of why we're here by design, is that we think that these conversations should overlap and inform each other where possible, that there's some really interesting things, I think, happening at the state level that we need to figure out how to get those stories and lessons to people like you and yourself and the colleagues here about what is happening so that we can inform those dialogues and conversations. But I think, at least from what ECS is hearing from our commissioners and members, Ben is pretty representative of that state perspective. I think we have another question from our virtual audience. Sarah.
Sure. So we have a question about state disinvestment in higher ed, and I think we've all been hearing lately how challenging those budgets have been in recent years. How does that factor into how states can think about redesigning aid, unlimited or dwindling budgets?
Another uplifting question for us. Right. So I'll say one thing to give you all for time to come up with a response to that. One of the things that did come up during the Thinkers meeting conversations about this is that we wanted to design a document and some guideposts that didn't rely on a foundation of only providing new and additional dollars into these systems. And so certainly the question of scarce resources is one that's really important, and it's something that we think and we know state decision makers are going to have to wrestle with. But we wanted to have some principles to guide these redesign conversations that could be appropriate and applicable to new programs that do capture new dollars that come in, but also can think about how we structure what are potentially insignificant resources or not significant resources to meet the challenges that we have. So that was one way that we're trying to get at that. But I think this question of sort of dwindling state investments or investments in public education that aren't as high as they once were certainly affects the impacts of these aid programs, but I don't know if anybody has a response they would like to share to the.
Well, I don't want to be too depressing here. I mean, for me, I think the state disinvestment in higher education, combined with sort of the shift of higher education towards being a private good, which I think we've all talked about for years and years and years, is just so depressing. And on some level, I'm hopeful that we've finally reached a critical point where we can start to turn the tide. But at the same time, I think part of the reason why there is disinvestment is, at least in the New England states, it's been a struggle to get state budgets back to where they need to be. And in an aging region where healthcare costs are huge, it's hard to argue for additional dollars for something like a state grant aid program. And I think something that we haven't talked about here is sort of the politics around state grant aid programs. Mm-hmm. And in some of our states, the programs are named after really specific people. And so that's something that's really difficult to touch. And I think something that's really difficult to think about, how can we use dollars a little bit more effectively? Because this is somebody's legacy. And that's an element here, I think, within sort of the college affordability conversation that I don't have an answer yet on how to approach, but I think it does need to be approached if we're really going to truly look at kind of how we're financing students' ability to go to college.
I think also with the defunding, it makes the state grant conversation all the more important, right? Because it means that tuition is going up and that the challenges to going to college are greater for low-income students. So, I mean, it's clearly true that if you have limited funds and you want more people to enroll and succeed in college, you need to fund the students who can't afford it. And so, I don't want to advocate higher tuition, but if you're going to have higher tuition, then higher aid becomes all the more important and is cheaper, actually, than low tuition.
Let's just say two things. One is that diminishing dollars has forced us to have, I think, an important conversation on how to focus on priorities, how to prioritize, right? And the hopeful side of that is that an increased focus can build the case for more dollars, right? That you can say, look, we've really established priorities. Here's the list, and if you invest more, we'll be able to get farther down that list in terms of what we're able to invest in and support. But the second piece, and this is true for diminished resources sort of across higher education, not just state grant programs, is that it strikes me that as a state policymaker with fewer dollars, state dollars going into higher ed, that a lot of these conversations that we think we're having about, or a lot of the impacts that we think we're having on outcomes and on institutions, we ought to be probably a lot more humble about. We have, in the state of Oregon, it's as little now, less than 20% of the revenues, the core educational revenues for our public universities come from the state. And that humility should, I think, though, not deter us from having the conversation and recognizing its importance in terms of signaling to institutions, to faculty, to students, to families about what's important. It's not the dollars, perhaps. I mean, because the dollars are so scarce. We'd like to think those are really driving outcomes, driving results. We hope they are. But the outcome, the dollars are so scarce, perhaps what's more important are the signals that we send. And so when we say that we're prioritizing low-income students with this grant program, that sends a very important signal to the public, to students, to institutions about state public priorities. And likewise, some of the other things that we've talked about here. So I think that's one sort of lesson that I draw from unfortunately, the diminishing state resources for higher ed.
Well, that's definitely a more positive note to end on with that conversation than I thought we were going to get. So thank you for that. We are coming towards the end of our time, and I want to just take a quick second to mention two sort of opportunities for engagement that are going to move this project forward, that we hope to have all of you and your colleagues and friends that aren't able to join us today participate in. The next sort of public release element of this work will be in mid-May. The Education Commission of the States is going to release a 50-state policy database that looks at the 100 largest financial aid programs across the U.S. states. These programs represent roughly 8 out of every $10 that states have spent in financial aid. And we've designed several guided pathways, kind of stories through the data for people to follow, to understand, and then certainly for those of you in the research community, you'll have access to that information to ask your own questions. Data elements include sort of the rules of disbursement for aid and the timing of that disbursement. We've looked at eligibility requirements, the renewal process, and length of time in which individuals can renew. And we continue to track sort of both originating legislation and authority that created these programs and updates to policy and regulations that impact them. So this has been an effort that Sarah's led up with a team at ECS, and we think it'll really provide a valuable resource to people that are interested in learning more about the fundamental structures and the mechanisms by which we disperse these aid dollars. Second, beginning this summer, ECS is going to issue a call for proposals for technical assistance to state leaders. And technical assistance is one of the sort of the bedrock things that Education Commission of the States does across the education spectrum on a number of issues, providing legislative testimony, reviewing bills, conducting research and data analysis. But through this partnership with USA funds and the organizations and individuals that engaged in the Thinkers meeting with us, we're going to have an intentional cohort of somewhere between 5 and 8 states that starting this summer for the next calendar year, we're going to work with on a specific financial aid redesign question or challenge that they submit to us and highlight. And so exactly what that technical assistance is going to look like will be determined, of course, by the requests that we get and the experts that we have available to assist. But that's a call that will be coming out in the next 4 to 6 weeks, and we have those states identified by midsummer, and we'll begin working with them in earnest. So we hope to not just help those individual states, but as Jeremy and Carol both alluded to in the opening of these comments, we really want to draw lessons out that we can provide to policymakers in other communities to really learn from. So those are the next 2 steps we have in the project. One last thing, the website that you've seen advertised here on the slides is up and available. The report is there. And there's an opportunity for engagement, because one of the things that we know is that as the beginning of a conversation, we need to continue to hear from voices that we've been talking to in the past, but certainly those that are just learning this project today. So there's an opportunity through the website for you to provide feedback and comments about what you think is working in state financial aid, what directions you'd like to see either the project or state policymakers go. And so we'll be asking for everyone's assistance who is here today to sort of push that out through your networks as well. So thank you again very much. Join me in thanking the panelists, and we look forward to good work moving forward.